When I saw the flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the white picket fences of the Maplewood Estates HOA, I couldn't help but laugh under my breath. The irony of it all was just too much. I had just stepped out of my own truck, onto my own property, a piece of land I had owned for over 15 years, when the HOA president, a woman named Karen Dalton, with her usual smug smile and clipboard, called the cops on me for trespassing. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just a homeowner. I was Judge Robert Hayes of the Maple County Circuit Court. The HOA had been under my judicial scrutiny for months for multiple civil violations. So when those two officers stepped out of their cruiser, hands on their belts and eyes scanning me like I was some kind of criminal, I decided right then that this was going to be the day I'd expose this entire corrupt HOA from top to bottom. But before I did, I played along. Because sometimes justice requires patience and a little performance. Before I tell you how I turned this entire neighborhood upside down, make sure to follow the channel, because what happened next will make every homeowner who's ever dealt with an HOA cheer out loud. The officers walked toward me, one tall and lanky, the other shorter with a clipboard of his own. "Sir, we got a call about someone trespassing here. Can we see your ID?" I handed it over calmly, saying nothing. Karen stood behind them, arms crossed, smirking like she had just won a battle. "That's him," she said in her sharp voice. "He's been warned before about entering HOX, a controlled property, without authorization." I couldn't believe the audacity. This was my land, purchased long before the HOA ever existed. They'd been trying for years to annex it into their jurisdiction, but the deed clearly excluded it. Still, they kept pushing, sending letters, fines, and threats. I'd been collecting every single document as evidence for the day I'd finally bring them to justice. The shorter officer looked down at my ID and paused. "Wait a minute," he said, his expression shifting. "You're Judge Hayes?" Karen's face dropped immediately. The taller officer stepped back slightly, clearing his throat. "Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding. We didn't realize," I stopped them with a raised hand. "No need to apologize. You're just doing your job." "But she," I said, pointing to Karen, "is about to find out what happens when someone files a false report against a sitting judge." Karen's lips trembled. I didn't know, he was on HOA property." I took a step forward. "No, Karen, this is my property. And you just crossed a line that's going to cost you and your board dearly." From that moment, the dynamic of Maplewood Estates began to unravel. Over the next few weeks, I quietly started building my case. Every resident who had been bullied, fined, or harassed by the HOA came forward with stories of illegal towing, unauthorized surveillance cameras, fines for grass being an inch too high, even threats to revoke access to the neighborhood park. I listened, documented, and gathered witness statements. What I discovered was a web of corruption led by Karen and a few of her board members. They had been pocketing funds, falsifying maintenance costs, and abusing their authority under the HOA charter. I didn't act immediately. I waited. Every move I made was deliberate. I had to ensure that when I finally struck, it would be clean, undeniable, and irreversible. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. These weren't community volunteers trying to maintain order, they were power-hungry opportunists preying on their neighbors. And the fact that they had the nerve to try and have me arrested for trespassing was the final straw. Karen, still unaware of the storm coming her way, continued her antics. She sent me another notice of violation, claiming I had an unauthorized structure on my land, a small shed I'd built 15 years earlier. When I ignored it, she escalated the fines. She even tried to file a lien, which, of course, was immediately rejected by the county registrar. That didn't stop her from telling everyone in the HOA newsletter that some residents were refusing to follow community rules and could face legal action. I attended the next HOA board meeting uninvited. When I walked in, the chatter stopped. Karen froze mid-sentence. I sat quietly in the back while she stammered through the agenda, pretending I wasn't there. When it came time for public comments, I raised my hand. "I'd like to make a statement," I said. Karen shifted uncomfortably. "Judge Hayes, this meeting is for residents under HOA jurisdiction." I smiled faintly. "Oh, I know. That's exactly why I'm here to clarify jurisdiction. The room went silent. I stood, pulled out a file from my briefcase, and placed it on the table. This is a certified copy of my property deed. You've been trying to fine and threaten me for land you have no legal authority over. And every notice, every email, and every harassment attempt you've made is now officially part of an investigation. Karen's face turned white. An investigation. By who? She asked weakly. By the Maple County Court, I replied. And I happen to know the judge personally. A few people chuckled nervously. Others stared at me, wide-eyed, realizing exactly what was happening. You've abused your power, violated property rights, and misused HOA funds, I continued. And as of tonight, I'm opening a formal inquiry into the governance of this board. Karen tried to recover, waving her hands dismissively. This is ridiculous. You can't just... I cut her off. Actually, I can. And I will. I leaned forward slightly. You see, you didn't just pick a fight with a homeowner. You've picked a fight with the very system that enforces the law you've been pretending to wield. The board meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Some residents stood and clapped. Others whispered frantically. Karen stormed out, muttering threats under her breath. I watched her go, calm and collected, knowing this was only the beginning. Because when people like her think they're untouchable, justice has a way of finding them where it hurts most, in their pride and their pocketbooks. Over the next several days, I filed the necessary motions, appointed an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances, and notified the County Ethics Committee. Evidence poured in: unauthorized charges, falsified invoices, and even a kickback scheme involving a landscaping company owned by Karen's cousin. It was worse than I imagined. But the real satisfaction came when Karen showed up at my door, shaking, holding a folder. Judge Hayes, please, she said. This is all a misunderstanding. We can fix this quietly. I took the folder from her and looked at the desperate woman who had once strutted around the neighborhood like a queen. You had your chance, I said softly. Now the law will decide. That night, as I watched the lights go out in her house, I knew she was realizing the same thing. Every corrupt HOA eventually does. Power is temporary, but accountability is permanent. And for Karen and her little empire, the reckoning had just begun. After that night at the HOA meeting, word spread through Maplewood Estates faster than wildfire. The residents, once afraid to speak out, started to realize that their oppressors weren't as invincible as they thought. For years, Karen and her board had maintained control through intimidation, fines, and manipulation. But now their power was crumbling, and everyone could feel it. I went about my days quietly, keeping a low profile while my formal investigation unfolded. Even though I was a judge, I had to maintain proper procedure. The case needed to be airtight, because HOA boards like this one often tried to wiggle out of accountability through technicalities. But the more I looked, the deeper the corruption went. There were missing funds of thousands of dollars in landscaping improvements that didn't exist, invoices from companies that had dissolved years ago, and even a strange trail of bank transfers made to an account under Karen's maiden name. It was obvious, she thought, no one would ever look closely. One morning I got a call from a man named Greg Turner, a soft-spoken resident who lived near the lake. He told me his family had been fined $500 for having a non-compliant mailbox. Even though it matched the community standards exactly, when he refused to pay, the HOA suspended his access to the shared facilities pool, gym, and even the trash disposal area. That was illegal. I asked him to bring all the letters and notices he had received. When he arrived at my home with a folder full of paperwork, I was stunned. Some of the letters bore forged signatures of past board members, one of whom had moved out of state years ago. Karen must have been signing their names, Greg said bitterly. She controls everything. Even the people who try to run against her for the board end up mysteriously disqualified. I thanked him for his courage and assured him his statement would be part of the record. By then, my assistant, an excellent clerk named Amanda, had already compiled over 200 pages of evidence from various residents. The deeper we dug, the more we uncovered. HOA bank statements showing unauthorized ATM withdrawals, kickbacks from roofing companies, inflated security contracts, and even personal purchases luxury handbags, concert tickets, an expensive wine all charged to the HOA account. This wasn't mismanagement. This was fraud, plain and simple. Meanwhile, Karen was spiraling. She'd stopped showing up to board meetings and had started sending out desperate HOA-wide emails, claiming that certain residents were spreading false accusations. She blamed outside influences, and even hinted that the investigation was politically motivated. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. Several of them approached me privately, some in tears, thanking me for standing up to her. They told me stories of being bullied into silence, of fines so high they had to sell their homes, property seizures that were legally questionable at best. The weight of their testimonies fueled my determination. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, while reviewing new financial records, I received a letter from the HOA's lawyer, an aggressive man named Richard Collins. The letter accused me of improperly interfering with HOA operations and threatened to file an injunction preventing me from harassing the board. I almost laughed. They were trying to intimidate me, the very person with the authority to bring them down. Still, I took it seriously. I documented the letter, filed a response, and requested a court hearing. If they wanted to escalate it legally, I was more than ready. The hearing was set for the following week at the Maple County Courthouse. When the day came, the courtroom was packed. Residents, reporters, even a few neighboring HOA members curious to see what would happen. Karen sat at the defense table with Richard, her lawyer, both of them looking pale and uneasy. I didn't preside over the case, of course. That would have been a conflict of interest. Another judge, my colleague and friend, Judge Williams, handled it. I sat at the petitioner's table as a private citizen. Armed with documentation and statements from nearly half the neighborhood, Judge Williams opened the proceedings. We're here to address allegations of harassment and misconduct involving the Maplewood Estates HOA and its board. He looked over his glasses at Richard. Counselor, you may begin? Richard stood, his tone rehearsed and defensive. Your Honor, this is a baseless smear campaign led by a disgruntled resident, Judge Williams interrupted. Resident. The petitioner is Judge Hayes, correct? Yes, Your Honor, but then I would suggest you choose your words more carefully, the courtroom murmured. Richard cleared his throat and continued. Regardless of the petitioner's occupation, the HOA has been unfairly targeted. These claims are exaggerated and stem from a personal vendetta. When it was my turn, I stood and walked to the center of the room. I spoke calmly, methodically. Your Honor, what you will see today is not exaggeration. It's a systematic abuse of power that has gone unchecked for years. I held up the thick binder of evidence. Inside this binder are over 70 notarized statements from residents who've suffered under the HOA's rule. There are bank statements, invoices, and even recorded admissions from board members who were pressured to stay silent. This isn't a vendetta. This is justice long overdue. Judge Williams leaned forward, scanning the binder I handed him. And you're saying this was all orchestrated by the current HOA president? I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Karen Dalton and several of her associates have used their positions for personal gain, violating state HOA statutes, and in some cases, committing outright fraud. The tension in the room was thick. Richard tried to object, but Judge Williams overruled him multiple times. Finally, after reviewing the evidence, the judge announced that he would appoint a forensic accountant and an independent auditor to examine all HOA finances. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Karen sat frozen, her face red, eyes darting nervously. I glanced at her, and for the first time, she didn't have that smug confidence. She knew this was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the audit revealed everything we suspected and more. The HOA's funds had been drained by over $130,000 in unauthorized transactions. Karen's cousin, who ran the landscaping company, had been overbilling for years. The board's treasurer had quietly resigned just before the investigation began. Leaving behind a trail of missing receipts and altered statements, it was chaos. The local news caught wind of it, and soon, Maplewood Estates became the headline for every evening broadcast. Judge investigates corrupt HOA, residents rejoice, one headline read. Another simply said, the judge next door brings down the board. But amid all the praise, I stayed focused. There were still people who needed justice, families who'd lost money, seniors who'd been threatened, and homeowners whose lives had been made miserable. I made sure every single one of them was heard. We filed a collective civil suit against the HOA board for financial restitution and emotional distress. By now, most of the board members had resigned, leaving Karen isolated and desperate. Late one night, I received another knock at my door. This time, it was one of Karen's former allies, a man named Don Pierce, who'd served as vice president. He looked exhausted. "Judge Hayes," he said quietly, "I can't keep doing this." She made us sign everything. Every fake invoice, every letter. I have copies of all of it.
Nice.
He handed me a flash drive. She said no one would ever find out. But you did. And I'm done protecting her. I thanked him, assuring him that his cooperation would be noted. When I opened the files later that night, I realized I now had the final piece of the puzzle, the proof of direct intent. Emails from Karen ordering the treasurer to adjust numbers. Messages about keeping certain residents in line, even threats to deal with the judge next door. She'd written it all. Never expecting those words to come back and destroy her? As the investigation moved closer to its conclusion, couldn't help but think about how arrogance always leads people like Karen to their downfall. They think rules are for others. But in the end, the same system they abuse becomes their greatest enemy. And I was going to make sure that when the final judgment came, it would be one the entire town would remember. The revelation of that missing $25,000 became the thread that unraveled. The final and most complex layer of corruption within the Maplewood Estates, HOA, what I had thought was just Karen's personal greed turned out to be part of a coordinated scheme involving multiple people who had all quietly benefited from the HOA's misuse of funds. It was like peeling back wallpaper and finding rot beneath every layer revealed more decay. The assistant district attorney, Laura Kent, moved quickly. Within days, subpoenas were issued for bank statements, contractor agreements, and corporate registrations linked to the suspicious transactions. What emerged was a tangled web of shell companies' names like GreenPath Management and Home Vision Services, all registered to post office boxes and linked back to one person, Richard Collins, the HOA's lawyer. When I learned about Richard's involvement, it hit me like a punch to the gut. He had stood in court weeks earlier defending Karen, calling me biased and vindictive, when all along he was knee-deep in the very fraud I was exposing. The DA's office confirmed that he had been receiving monthly consulting payments from HOA accounts through these fake entities. Essentially, he'd been paying himself with homeowners' money while pretending to represent the board. It was one of the most blatant ethical violations I'd ever seen. But this discovery gave us the leverage we needed to dismantle the corruption completely. The next week, investigators raided Richard's law office. The sight of officers hauling out boxes of documents, hard drives, and computer equipment became the talk of the town. Residents who had once feared even mentioning the HOA's name now stood on sidewalks, openly cheering as the symbols of their torment were finally falling apart. I stayed on the sidelines, watching everything unfold quietly. I wasn't doing this for applause. I was doing it for every family that had been bullied, every retiree who'd been overcharged, and every child who'd seen their parents harassed for something as small as leaving a bicycle on the lawn. When the DA's office called me in for a meeting the following week, Laura Kent had a new expression, a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Robert," she said, sliding a file across the table, "you were right. This wasn't just Karen. Richard was her partner, and they both used the HOA like their personal bank. The $25,000 you spotted was part of a larger laundering system. We estimate they funneled nearly $200,000 through fake maintenance and landscaping contracts over 3 years." I nodded grimly. "And the residents?" She smiled faintly. "We'll make sure they get every dollar back through restitution." That was the first piece of good news I'd heard in months. But the case still had one more act left. The DA's office scheduled a formal court hearing to present the findings. Karen, already facing charges of fraud, conspiracy, and misappropriation, would be joined by Richard, who was now under investigation for wire fraud and legal misconduct. The courtroom that day was so full that people stood along the walls, Residents came dressed in their Sunday best, ready to witness justice firsthand. I took my seat in the front row, watching as the defendants were led in. Karen looked like a shadow of her former self, pale, thin, and visibly nervous. Richard, ever the arrogant lawyer, tried to maintain composure, but couldn't hide the sweat on his brow. When the judge entered, the room went silent. Laura Kent presented the evidence methodically. The fake invoices, the bank records, the forged signatures. She played one of the recordings where Karen openly discussed using HOA money for her personal benefit. The words echoed through the courtroom, leaving no room for doubt. Richard's defense fell apart almost immediately. He tried to argue that he didn't know the payments were illegal. But the emails Laura presented, D-mails where he personally approved the transactions, destroyed that claim. When it was over, the judge looked at both defendants and said in a firm, steady voice, "This court has seen many cases of greed and abuse of authority, but few as brazen as this. You took advantage of your community, manipulated the system, and violated the trust placed in you. For that, you will both face the consequences." He sentenced Karen to 5 years in state prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the residents. Richard received 7 years and was permanently disbarred. The gasps and murmurs from the courtroom turned into applause when the gavel struck. For the first time, Maplewood Estates saw justice done not just in theory, but in reality. After the trial, as everyone filtered out of the courthouse, Greg Turner approached me again, this time with tears in his eyes. "Judge Hayes," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we couldn't have done this without you." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You could have," I replied softly. "You just needed someone to remind you that you had the right to fight back." Around us, people hugged, smiled, and talked about the future, about rebuilding the HOA. It's time with integrity and transparency. For them, this was more than just a legal victory. It was the end of years of fear. But I knew rebuilding wouldn't be easy. The entire structure of Maplewood Estates had been poisoned by corruption. The community needed new leadership, new bylaws, and most importantly, trust. So when the county asked me to serve as an interim advisor during the HOA's reformation period, I agreed. For the next 6 months, I worked alongside a committee of residents to rewrite the HOA charter from scratch. We made sure there were safeguards and placed clear term limits for board members, transparent accounting procedures, and an independent audit requirement every year. We even implemented a whistleblower clause to protect anyone who spoke up against misconduct. The goal was to ensure that what happened under Karen would never happen again. During that time, I got to know the residents on a more personal level. I attended block parties, helped organize volunteer cleanups, and watched the neighborhood slowly come back to life. The lawns that had once been points of contention became gathering spots for families. The park that Karen had neglected was restored by the very people she had tried to control. It was as if the entire community had taken a deep breath after years of suffocation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole situation had been orchestrated from higher up. The level of financial manipulation suggested professional knowledge beyond what Karen and Richard were capable of. My suspicions were confirmed when Laura Kent called me one evening. "Robert," she said, "we've traced one of the shell companies to an investment firm in Chicago. It looks like they were using the HOA as a money laundering hub for other communities too. We're talking multiple states." The thought was chilling. "So Maplewood wasn't an isolated case," I said quietly. "Not at all," Laura replied. "You may have just uncovered part of a nationwide scheme." That revelation reignited my determination. The victory at Maplewood was monumental, but now I realized it might just be the beginning of something much larger. If HOAs across the country were being used for financial crimes, someone had to hold them accountable. Laura suggested forming a task force to investigate similar operations, and she wanted me on it as a legal consultant. I didn't hesitate to say yes. Justice, after all, didn't stop at my front gate. It extended to every neighborhood where people were being silenced by greed and power. As I looked out over Maplewood one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about how far the community had come. From corruption to redemption, from fear to freedom. What had started as a personal battle against one woman's abuse of authority had turned into a crusade for fairness. Karen had tried to have me arrested for trespassing on my own land. In the end, it was she who trespassed on the land paid the price. But deep down, I knew this story wasn't over. The cracks I'd uncovered in the HOA system were just the beginning, and the fight to reform it had only just begun. And if I had to take on a dozen more corrupt boards across the country to make things right, I would. Because no one, not even those hiding behind neighborhood bylaws and fake smiles, was above the law. The chaos within the HOA reached a breaking point after my quiet, but firm push for accountability began tearing at the threads of their lies. Once the news spread that their accusations against me had failed and the truth about their misconduct was surfacing, panic consumed them. Karen, still refusing to admit defeat, tried to hold emergency board meetings, but attendance dwindled with every passing day. The once loyal board members now avoided her calls, whispering behind her back that she'd gone too far. I would often see her pacing by her car near the community park, barking orders into her phone, trying to rally what was left of her influence. But fear had replaced loyalty. People had begun to see her for what she truly was, a manipulative tyrant who thrived on intimidation. The residents, once silent under her control, were finally speaking up. I began receiving thank you notes, small gestures left at my doorstep. As neighbors expressed their gratitude for taking a stand, it was strange to see how quickly a community that had been fractured by fear began to heal the moment. The source of their oppression started to crumble. Still, Karen wasn't ready to let go. In one last desperate attempt, she filed a formal complaint against me with the State Judicial Board, claiming I had used my influence unethically. She demanded an inquiry into my abuse of power. I knew her ploy was baseless. Everything I'd done had been legal and within my rights as a homeowner. But she wanted to tarnish my reputation, to make me fight on multiple fronts at once. When the notice of the complaint arrived, I smiled. Instead of panicking, I gathered my documentation, evidence, and witnesses. During the inquiry, the panel listened carefully as I presented every lie, every email, and every action the HOA had taken to target me. The more they saw, the more incredulous they became. By the time it was over, not only was I cleared of all accusations, but the panel also referred Karen's conduct for further investigation under harassment statutes. It was a satisfying moment, one where truth silenced deceit completely. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's atmosphere continued shifting. For the first time in years, homeowners began attending meetings without fear. The interim HOA president, a humble, spoken man named Daniel, who had lived quietly under Karen's reign, stood up during one session and announced new transparency reforms. There would be no more secret fines, no more selective enforcement, and no more private surveillance of residents. Every policy would now be subject to community vote. The applause that followed shook the entire room. It wasn't just approval, it was liberation. People began decorating their homes again, repainting fences, even planting gardens that Karen once deemed non-compliant. The oppressive uniformity she demanded vanished, replaced by individuality and life. It was incredible to witness how quickly people regained their spirit once they felt safe to express themselves again. Still, despite the community's progress, Karen's shadow lingered. She began spiraling publicly, confronting people on sidewalks, shouting about conspiracies, and accusing me of ruining everything. She even cornered a local news reporter outside the courthouse one morning, claiming the story had been fabricated by corrupt judges. The footage went viral online, portraying her as unstable. That's when her last remaining supporters finally abandoned her. Her lawyer quit, citing irreconcilable differences. And the HOA insurance provider dropped coverage for her legal expenses. It was poetic justice. The empire she built on intimidation now stood in ruins, collapsing entirely because of her inability to stop fighting battles she had already lost. The county's attorney's office eventually charged her with obstruction, falsifying reports, and malicious harassment after reviewing all the documentation from the civil case. When I saw her being led out of the courthouse by deputies, it wasn't with satisfaction or gloating. It was quiet closure. The woman who once tried to put me in jail for walking on my own property was now facing real accountability for her actions. But despite everything, I didn't feel hatred. I felt relief. Justice had a strange way of balancing itself when given the chance to work properly. Life at the ranch soon returned to peace. I spent my mornings walking along the trails that had been the center of so much tension. The birds sang again, and the wind carried only the scent of pine and soil, no longer the weight of conflict. The new HOA began cooperating with residents rather than policing them, and the balance that was once destroyed slowly returned. I even saw families moving back into homes that had been up for sale during the chaos, hopeful that this time the community would truly belong to the people, who lived there, not to the board that claimed to represent them. Months passed, and the neighborhood transformed completely. The hostility, the division, the constant surveillance, all gone. One evening, I received an invitation to a community barbecue, the first one in nearly 5 years. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure how people would react to me showing up after everything that had happened, but when I arrived, I was met with handshakes, laughter, and genuine gratitude. People who had once avoided eye contact now approached me freely, sharing stories about how much better things had become. They had found their voices again. That night, under a canopy of string lights, as children ran through the grass and music filled the air, it hit me just how far we had come. The same community that had once been broken by power now stood united by resilience. But even as peace returned, reminders of the past lingered in quiet ways. Sometimes when I drove past Karen's old house, now empty, with a for sale sign swaying in the wind, I thought about how absolute control had cost her everything. The lesson was bitter but clear. You can't build a kingdom on fear and expect it to last. I had seen firsthand what unchecked power could do. I vowed to ensure it never happened again. Not in this neighborhood, not under my watch. Still, there were moments of unease. Late one evening, I noticed a car parked at the end of my driveway, its headlights off. It stayed for a few minutes before driving away slowly. I didn't think much of it at first, but when it happened again a few days later, I knew better than to ignore it. Karen may have been gone, but someone still hadn't let go of the past. I started documenting everything again, old habits kicking in, just in case the story wasn't quite over yet. Maybe it was a paranoid neighbor, or maybe someone else wanted to test the boundaries once more. Either way, I was prepared because I'd already proven once that standing up for what's right doesn't just protect one person. It protects everyone. That night, as I locked my gate and looked out at the empty road stretching into the distance, I couldn't help but wonder if peace ever truly lasted in places built on conflict. But whatever came next, I knew this. I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd faced the worst of their power and walked away stronger. The HOA could rebuild. New people could come and go. But they'd always know there was someone here who wouldn't let them cross the line again. The quiet that settled over the neighborhood in the months following the trial felt almost foreign at first, like a silence too good to trust. For so long, every knock on the door, every letter in the mailbox, every unfamiliar car had carried the potential for conflict. Now there was only peace, and yet it took time to believe it was real. The HOA, once a symbol of fear and authority, was little more than a memory. The new board, led by Daniel, was transparent, approachable, and determined not to repeat the sins of the past. Meetings were open to the public, budgets were shared, and for the first time, people actually showed up not out of fear, but because they cared. The sense of community that had long been destroyed was finally being rebuilt from the ground up. I'd drive through the neighborhood and see families gardening together, kids riding bikes without being scolded for noise violations, and neighbors laughing over fences that had once divided them. It was as if the place itself was healing, and yet, beneath the calm surface, there was still a sense of unfinished business, like the final chapter of a long story waiting to be written. It began one early morning when I received a letter marked confidential. It wasn't from the HOA, nor from the county or state. It was from an attorney representing several neighboring communities. They had been following my case closely and wanted my help. Their own HOAs had started abusing power the same way Karen's board once had, issuing arbitrary fines, intimidating homeowners, even coordinating with local police to silence dissent. They'd heard how I'd stood my ground, and they wanted guidance on how to fight back legally. I sat at my desk reading through the letter, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and purpose. I had thought my war was over, that justice had already been served. But now it seemed that what happened here was part of something much larger. Maybe this wasn't just a single battle. Maybe it was the start of a movement. That night, I drove out to the edge of my property, where the neighborhood lights faded into open land. I stood under the stars, thinking about how far everything had come from being accused of trespassing on my own land to standing here now. A free man who had not only reclaimed his home but inspired others to do the same. I realized then that power isn't measured by authority or title. It's measured by integrity. Karen and her board had mistaken fear for strength, and it had destroyed them. I had chosen truth, and though the path was long and brutal, it had set everything right in the end. Weeks later, I met with the attorneys and representatives from those neighboring communities. We sat in a modest conference room, a dozen people from different towns, each with their own version of the same story: unfair treatment, intimidation, retaliation. As they spoke, I could see the same frustration in their eyes that I once felt. They were tired of being bullied in their own homes. That meeting turned into a coalition, a network of homeowners determined to reclaim their rights. I agreed to advise them, not as a judge, but as someone who had been in their shoes. Word spread quickly, and within months, more communities joined. Soon, news outlets began covering what they called the Homeowner Justice Initiative, a growing effort to reform abusive HOA practices statewide. It was surreal to see something born out of personal struggle become a cause that touched so many lives. Meanwhile, life in my own neighborhood flourished. The community began hosting seasonal fairs, fundraisers, and volunteer cleanups. There was a renewed sense of belonging that had been missing for years. I even found myself attending more often than I expected, not because I was needed, but because I wanted to be there. Daniel, the new HOA president, often thanked me publicly for what I'd done, though I always deflected the credit back to the people. It was their courage that changed everything. I had just lit the first match. Even the sheriff's department, once caught in Karen's web of influence, reached out to commend the neighborhood's recovery. For the first time, our county was being recognized as a model of reform. As for Karen, her story ended quietly. She was convicted on several misdemeanor charges and sentenced to probation. Her mugshot briefly appeared in the local paper, a haunting contrast to the confident woman she once was. After that, she disappeared from public life entirely. Rumor had it she moved in with family out of state, avoiding contact with anyone from the old neighborhood. I didn't wish her harm. In some strange way, I hoped she found peace. People like her thrived on control, and when that control was taken away, it left a void they didn't know how to fill. Perhaps losing everything was the only way she could truly see herself. One crisp autumn morning, I walked the boundary of my property, the same stretch of land where all of this had begun. The sun peeked through the trees, scattering light across the grass, and I paused by the gate that once separated my ranch from the HOA's jurisdiction. The metal still bore faint scratches from where Karen's private security guards had tried to cut through years ago. I ran my hand along it and smiled. That gate wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a reminder of everything that had been fought for and won. The land felt alive again, not haunted by conflict, but strengthened by it. Later that week, a local journalist interviewed me for a piece on HOA reform. She asked me one question that stuck in my mind long after the camera stopped rolling. If you could go back and avoid the whole ordeal, would you? I thought about it for a long time before answering. No, I said finally, because justice doesn't exist unless someone's willing to fight for it. And sometimes you don't realize you're that someone until there's no one else left. That night, as I sat on my porch under a sky filled with stars, I reflected on how this all began, a simple accusation of trespassing that spiraled into a war of power and principle. What the HOA meant to destroy had instead created something lasting, a movement, a message, and a community that refused to be silenced again. The crickets hummed in the fields, and the soft rustle of the trees reminded me that peace, once hard-won, is the most beautiful sound of all. This story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been bullied by power and found the courage to push back. As I took one last look at the quiet neighborhood lights in the distance, I felt gratitude more than anything else for the struggle, for the victory, and for the lesson it carried. Justice, like the truth, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand firm. And when it does, no one, not even the most corrupt HOA, can tear it down. Subscribe to Sham Stories for more powerful tales of justice, courage, and redemption. Because sometimes standing your ground isn't just the right thing to do. It's the only thing that sets you free. When the HOA realized that their case against me was unraveling, panic swept through their ranks like wildfire. Karen, their self-appointed queen, called for an emergency board meeting late into the night, hoping to salvage what little power they still had left. But their desperation only made things worse. I began receiving anonymous letters and threats slipped under my door, each one trying to intimidate me into backing down. The sheriff's department opened an investigation into harassment after I presented the evidence. And the moment they traced the letters back to the HOA office printer, their fate was sealed. I could almost feel the walls closing in on them as the reality of their actions caught up. They had tried to frame me, manipulate law enforcement, and abuse their authority over the neighborhood. Now the tables were fully turned. Meanwhile, residents who had once been too afraid to speak started approaching me quietly in grocery stores and parking lots, thanking me for standing up to the tyranny they had endured for years. Stories poured out in just fines for lawn lengths, threats of liens over minor paint issues, and invasive property inspections conducted under the guise of HOA compliance. It became clear this was more than just a dispute. It was a pattern of control and greed that had gone unchecked for far too long. As the court date for my civil case against the HOA approached, Karen's once unwavering confidence began to crumble. She tried to act tough during depositions, but her inconsistencies were glaring. I sat across from her, calm and unbothered. As she tried to explain how I could be trespassing on land that was legally mine, her lawyer fumbled, her board members avoided eye contact, and every document I presented strengthened my position. The evidence was overwhelming: recordings of her ordering private security to follow me, copies of fake violation letters, and emails proving she had pressured officers into arresting me. Every lie they told came back like a boomerang, striking harder each time. The public began taking notice too. Local reporters started sniffing around the story after whispers spread about the judge who took down the HOA. I didn't seek fame or attention, but their coverage helped expose what was happening. And suddenly, the HOA's pristine image began to crack. Karen's next move was perhaps her most desperate. She tried to have me disqualified from my own case, filing a motion claiming I had a conflict of interest because of my judicial position. But the irony was almost laughable. This was a civil matter unrelated to any courtroom I presided over. The motion was denied immediately, and the judge overseeing the case admonished her attorney for wasting the court's time. By that point, I could sense Karen was unraveling mentally. She showed up at the courthouse one morning shouting accusations, her voice trembling with rage. The sight of the woman who had once wielded fear over an entire community, now reduced to public outbursts, was both tragic and poetic. Her fellow board members began distancing themselves, some even turning on her to save themselves. They claimed they'd been manipulated by her, coerced into signing documents without understanding their implications. But the truth was, they'd all enjoyed the power until it turned against them. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. The HOA was found guilty of harassment, defamation, and abuse of power. The court ordered them to pay significant damages and impose strict reforms to their operations. The board was dissolved, and a new one would be elected under court supervision. The neighborhood was finally free from Karen's reign of intimidation. When the ruling was read, Karen sat motionless, her face drained of color, as if the weight of her downfall had crushed the last bit of defiance she had left. The same officers she once used to bully others now escorted her out of the courtroom for disorderly conduct when she tried to protest the judgment. The irony was profound. She had wanted me behind bars, yet she was the one leaving in handcuffs. The aftermath of the trial was surprisingly emotional for many residents. They organized a neighborhood gathering to celebrate the end of the old HOA regime. And though I wasn't one for public attention, I attended. People shared stories, some cried, and others simply smiled in relief. It was more than just about winning a legal battle. It was about restoring trust, peace, and fairness. Karen's name became almost taboo. No one dared to utter it anymore. Her house went up for sale a month later, and word spread that she had left town entirely. Some said she moved to another state. Others whispered she tried to start over under a new name. Whatever the truth, she was gone, and the neighborhood could finally breathe again. I resumed my life quietly, spending more time at my ranch, walking through the land that had caused so much conflict, yet remained my sanctuary. The sun rose each morning over the same trees, the same fields, but everything felt different, lighter, freer. One afternoon, as I stood by the old fence line where Karen once accused me of trespassing, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. That fence, which had once been a boundary of contention, now stood as a reminder of victory and resilience. The neighbors, who had once looked away when injustice occurred, now waved as they passed, their faces brighter, no longer burdened by fear of retaliation from the HOA. Months later, I received an invitation to speak at a community legal forum about property rights and HOA overreach. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit that chapter, but then I realized my story could help others. I stood before that audience and shared everything, not as a judge, but as a homeowner who refused to be bullied. The response was overwhelming. People lined up afterward to thank me, share their experiences, and seek advice. That day, I understood that what happened wasn't just about one neighborhood. It reflected a much larger issue across communities everywhere. My fight had inspired others to stand up too. In the end, I didn't need to shut them down in the literal sense. The HOA had destroyed itself with its corruption, arrogance, and greed. All I did was hold up a mirror. Justice didn't require revenge, required truth. And once the truth came out, everything else fell into place. Standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt an immense sense of peace. I had my home, my integrity, and the satisfaction of knowing that no one would ever use their position to intimidate another resident again. Karen's legacy of control had ended where it began, at the fence line she once guarded so fiercely. The lesson was clear. Power built on fear is never real power at all. As the cool evening breeze swept through the ranch and the crickets began their song, I knew this chapter was finally closed. Justice had been served, and the community was reborn stronger than ever. Subscribe to Sham Stories for more gripping tales of justice, revenge, and the power of standing up for what's right, because sometimes the truth really does set you free. **